Hi, everybody. This week we are talking about how to think about emotions in media research, and we're also thinking about how a particular method, the method of the interview, is a useful strategy you can use to breathe a bit of life into your research and dig a little deeper into the motivations that lie behind why people use media and the way that they feel about their media experiences. So we're going to go through a number of steps. Firstly, in this video, I'm going to just give some introductory comments on why we would study emotion. In the second step, we're going to be looking at the role that emotions have played in the development of media research with regard to the work of Brenton Mallin, who is one of the key readings for this week. And what we're going to be seeing is how Mallin introduces the idea that emotions and ways of handling emotions and ways of thinking about emotional engagements with media were a really important driver in the development of critical media research. Then next we're going to move on to the work of Anne Bartsch, and Anne Bartsch's work, which comes from the uses and gratifications paradigm, is worth looking at because it's an excellent demonstration of how the purpose of research can be connected to social need through policy. So that's a really important article to look at as an example of how someone approaches the social importance and the social applications of media research. And then the third thing we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at the interview, and I'm going to be suggesting that interviewing is a logical method to think about at this point, because what you're actually doing a lot in an interview is managing emotions, both the emotions of the people that you're interviewing, but also your emotions. And quite often you'll be researching emotional connections to media as well. So that's the link there. And then finally, we're going to be ending up with some exercises to discuss at the next tutorial, where you consider the role that interviewing might play in your project. So let's just jump right ahead and make some further introductory comments. So why study emotion? Well, I suppose if we think about what media do, the mistake a lot of us make is that we think about information, we think about media in terms of information, and media describe things, they inform us, so on and so forth. But if you really think about it, most of the time when we engage with media, particularly for pleasure, we want to feel something. But even the news, and what this is really sort of underlines to us is that if we only ask what people think about media or what they do in relation to it, we're missing out a massive part of the experience. So the question of how media creates emotional states is a really important one, and is kind of one that none of the other questions that we might ask make sense without. And for example, here's a quote from Donald Trump, where he's basically expressing himself in an incredibly emotional way about his feelings about the media. And we can say that there's a certain truth to this tweet, because what it's recognizing quite clearly is that emotions are an important part of communication and politics. However you might feel about the message, there's a certain truth to this. And this is also an example of how media make the world. In Donald Trump's emotional use of Twitter has become an important part of political communication, whether he's having a joke, whether he's bragging, whether he's attacking people. The content is very emotional, and that's a very important part of our global political world today. So if you were to approach global politics simply from the point of view of global political communication is about transmission of arguments and facts, well, you wouldn't be able to explain Donald Trump, and Donald Trump's a pretty big part of the global world. So this tells us why it's important to think about emotion. And we're doing this because it's kind of part of a trend in media research at the moment. Um, so, for example, Karen Walker Jorgensen recently wrote a book called Emotions, Media and Politics. And that was very much prompted by her perception that there's a rise in angry politics where the emotion of anger is used quite often to express oneself, even from political leaders. And I suppose this is kind of a uh, part of a movement that encourages us to think of media research as more about the kind of creation of social and cultural states. So it's part of a really important move where we look at media messages as more than simply information or some kind of stimulus, something that automatically provokes some type of reaction. So emotions have become an important part in developing a holistic view of media influence. And this is seen most recently in the connection of emotion to politics and seeing political communication as an emotional field, an exercise in emotion as much as it is anything else. And we're reading Malin. So how is this lecture going to pan out? We're reading Malin because he uses emotions to write a really important history of media research that you all need to pay attention to. So thinking about emotions helps us to identify, and thanks to Malin, that media researchers often forget. And this is really important because emotional content is an important part of, according to Malin, overcoming fairly simplistic views of media effects, whereby media messages are shown to audiences who then respond in a particular way. And this, to be honest with you, this is a mistake that a lot of students make in their work. And so you really need to review the Malin piece on how emotions allow us to think about media influence in a more sophisticated way. Now, Barch is an interesting study, and Barch's work, I think, because it's an example of quantitative effects research using uses and gratifications theory that really pays attention to Malin's thoughts on emotions. And it's an excellent example of connecting research to a social need, in particular, how researching emotions and pleasure in media can help address the challenge of societies who face aging populations. So it's very much about placing emotions into a social status and into a social context. Also a really good job of deriving a research question from scholarly sources, and also she's aware of what her study can't do. So it's a great model of why emotions matter and also how you should set about your research. And then connecting to that, we're going to read Janet Ralston's work on how to do interviews, because interviews are, I suppose, a way of getting to know the full story behind a particular reaction or a particular media experience. And it's quite useful for you because it's a method that's easy to access. It's something that's really easy to do. Most of us can find someone to talk to about media and the media they use. But the really important thing to recognize is it isn't a method that's easy to do. And one of the reasons for that is because there are a series of emotional issues that you need to think about before you start talking to somebody. And that's an important ethical issue as well. So here's an example of, by looking at the interviewing method, we can see how the question of emotions in media has super practical importance because it relates directly to the ethics of research. And that's a very, very important topic. And then what we're going to end up with is something for you to do before the next tutorial. And I just want you to sit down and think about how your project will benefit from asking how media make people feel. Try and place your project in some of the problems that Malin found in the history of media research. So Malin kind of argues that media research has gone wrong in a few areas, and you need to think about, make sure that yours isn't doing the same thing. I want you to use these readings to think about how your project relates to the topic of well-being. And this is really different from anything about any sorts of questions about how media can be used to persuade people to do a particular thing or further company goals. I'm really trying to use Bartsch's reading to get you to think about the social relevance of your study. And then finally, I want you to use Ralston's work to consider how you might set about doing online interviewing in your research. So those are the ideas that we're going to map out this week.